27 years in aviation maintenance, and it came down to this: Operations Chief Greg Lawson standing in the hangar doorway, blocking my path to Flight 447's routine inspection with nothing but a smirk and decades of accumulated arrogance. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the satisfaction he took in this moment. Behind him, the Boeing 737 waited like a silent witness to what would become the beginning of the end. "Too old to keep up with aviation standards," he said, arms crossed like some corporate bouncer. The morning shift was just beginning around us, the familiar symphony of air compressors, hydraulic lifts, and radio chatter that had been the soundtrack to my professional life for nearly 3 decades. "Maybe you should finally retire before you kill someone." The words hung in the recycled hangar air, thick with the scent of jet fuel and industrial lubricants. I could feel the weight of 27 years pressing down on my shoulders, every emergency repair at 2 in the morning, every critical inspection that meant the difference between a safe flight and a headline tragedy, every time I'd crawled into tight spaces that younger technicians couldn't navigate because experience had taught me exactly where to look for trouble. I nodded calmly. What else could I do? At 58, Riley Radison had seen enough workplace politics to know when a battle wasn't worth fighting in the moment. My knees ached from decades of crouching in cargo holds, my hands bore the permanent stains of hydraulic fluid and engine oil, and my hair had long since turned the color of winter clouds. But my mind was sharp as ever, my knowledge deeper than any manual could contain. Yet here I stood, being dismissed like some relic from aviation's past. As I watched him swagger away, clipboard in hand, something cold settled in my chest, not anger, exactly, but a crystalline clarity about what this moment represented. This wasn't about age or competence, this was about power, plain and simple. About a middle manager flexing his authority because he could, consequences be damned. Let me back up and tell you how I got here, because context matters in aviation as much as it does in storytelling. Every failure has a history, every disaster a chain of decisions that led to catastrophe. This story begins long before that morning confrontation, rooted in the slow erosion of respect for experience that had been eating away at Aerosystems International like corrosion on an aluminum wing. Aerosystems had been my second home since I was 31, fresh from technical school with grease under my fingernails and fire in my belly. I'd grown up in a family where machines mattered. My father had been a mechanic at the local Ford plant, my grandfather a railroad engineer who could diagnose a locomotive problem by the sound of its engine 3 miles away. But aviation was different from cars or trains. In aviation, slightly off could mean death for hundreds of people at 35,000 feet. The margin for error was razor thin, the consequences of failure unthinkable. That's why I'd chosen this field, because it demanded perfection, because it respected precision, because it had no patience for shortcuts or approximations. Those early years were brutal. I was one of maybe 6 women in a workforce of 200, and the assumption was universal: I wouldn't last. Women weren't cut out for the physical demands, the technical complexity, the high-pressure environment where lives hung in the balance of every decision. The comments ranged from patronizing to crude, the opportunities limited, the scrutiny constant. Every mistake was magnified, every success minimized. The breakthrough came during my 5th year, during the inspection of a DC-10 that was scheduled for a transcontinental flight. Everything checked out according to the manual, hydraulic pressures normal, control surfaces responding correctly, all systems green across the board. But something felt wrong. The elevator controls had just a fraction more play than they should have, barely perceptible but there nonetheless. Another technician might have signed off on it, trusting the instruments over intuition. I didn't. I recommended pulling the aircraft for deeper inspection, despite pressure from scheduling to clear it for departure. The supervisor wasn't happy, delays cost money, and money was always the bottom line. But I held my ground, insisting that passenger safety trumped schedule concerns. 3 hours later, we found a microscopic crack in the elevator control cable, invisible to casual inspection but potentially catastrophic under flight stress. That incident changed everything. Word spread through the pilot community that Riley Radison was the technician you wanted signing off on your aircraft. Captains started specifically requesting my inspections, trusting my judgment over their own instruments. My reputation grew from reluctant acceptance to genuine respect, not because I was a woman succeeding in a man's field, but because I was a professional who could be trusted with lives. Over the years, I'd prevented dozens of potential disasters through careful attention to details others missed. The cargo door seal that showed signs of premature wear, indicating a pressurization system malfunction waiting to happen. The engine mount bolts that were properly torqued but showed stress patterns suggesting metal fatigue. The navigation system that tested normally but exhibited intermittent anomalies that could have led to spatial disorientation in bad weather. Each save reinforced my understanding that aviation safety wasn't just about following checklists, it was about bringing experience, intuition, and hard-earned wisdom to bear on problems that textbooks couldn't anticipate. It was about understanding that machines, like people, had personalities, quirks, and ways of communicating their distress if you knew how to listen. But corporate culture was shifting. The old-timers who'd hired me, who valued experience over credentials, were retiring or being pushed aside. New management brought MBA thinking to aviation maintenance. Everything could be quantified, systematized, reduced to procedures that any adequately trained person could follow. Experience was expensive, fresh graduates were cheap. Wisdom was unpredictable, protocols were standardizable. Greg Lawson embodied this new philosophy. He'd joined Aerosystems 3 years earlier with impressive credentials, engineering degree from a prestigious university, MBA from an even more prestigious business school, previous experience optimizing manufacturing processes for automotive companies. On paper, he was exactly what modern aviation needed, someone who could bring efficiency and cost control to what he saw as an outdated, tradition-bound industry. What he lacked was any real understanding of how aviation actually worked at the operational level. He'd never spent a night crawling through the belly of a 747, flashlight clenched between his teeth while troubleshooting a hydraulic leak in freezing temperatures. He'd never felt the gut-churning responsibility of signing off on an inspection knowing that 300 lives depended on getting it right. He'd never experienced the particular combination of pride and terror that comes with watching an aircraft you've just cleared for service disappear into the sky, carrying its precious cargo toward destinations thousands of miles away. To Lawson, I represented everything wrong with traditional aviation maintenance: expensive experience when cheaper alternatives existed, resistance to change when efficiency demanded adaptation, individual judgment when standardized procedures could eliminate variables. I was, in his view, a relic of aviation's past holding back its efficient, profitable future. The antagonism had been building for months before our final confrontation. It started with small things, questioning my repair recommendations, requiring additional documentation for decisions I'd been making autonomously for decades, assigning junior technicians to assist with inspections I could have completed alone in half the time. Each interaction was professionally polite on the surface but carried an underlying message: your time is ending, your methods are obsolete, your judgment is no longer trusted. I tried to adapt, tried to work within the new system he was implementing. But aviation maintenance isn't like manufacturing widgets on an assembly line. Each aircraft is unique, with its own history of repairs, modifications, and operational stress. Experience teaches you to see patterns that procedures don't capture, to recognize when normal readings might actually indicate developing problems, to understand the subtle ways that aircraft communicate their condition to those who know how to listen. The morning of the incident started like thousands of others before it. I arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, my thermos filled with coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and made my way through the security checkpoint with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this routine for nearly 3 decades. The early morning crew was already busy, fuel trucks rumbling across the tarmac, baggage carts weaving between aircraft, the constant ballet of preparation that transforms empty planes into vessels carrying hundreds of people across continents. Flight 447 sat in Bay 7, a Boeing 737-800 with registration number N4447AS, a mid-sized workhorse that had logged over 40,000 flight hours since rolling off the production line in Seattle 8 years earlier. I knew this particular aircraft well. I'd performed her last 3 major inspections, watching her accumulate the inevitable wear patterns that come with commercial service. She was a solid bird, well-maintained and reliable, but recent entries in her maintenance log had caught my attention. 3 weeks prior, the flight crew had reported intermittent hydraulic pressure fluctuations in the primary system during descent. The subsequent inspection had found no obvious problems: fluid levels normal, pump pressures within specifications, no visible leaks or component damage. The issue was logged as intermittent, unable to reproduce, and the aircraft was cleared for continued service with instructions to monitor the system closely. But I'd seen this pattern before. Hydraulic systems don't lie. When pilots report pressure fluctuations, something is usually wrong even if you can't immediately identify what. Sometimes it's a failing pressure sensor giving false readings. Sometimes it's internal, wear in a pump or valve that hasn't progressed far enough to show obvious symptoms. Sometimes it's something as simple as trapped air in the lines, invisible but potentially catastrophic under the wrong conditions. Standard procedure dictated checking fluid levels, testing pump outputs, and visually inspecting all accessible components. If everything checked out, you signed off on the aircraft and sent it on its way. But experience taught a different lesson. When multiple crew members report the same intermittent problem across several flights, you keep digging until you find the root cause, even if it means delaying departures and angering schedulers who only see dollar signs. That's exactly what I was planning to investigate when Lawson appeared, flanked by two junior technicians I barely recognized, Peterson and Walsh, probably 6 months out of certification training, still carrying their toolboxes like they were afraid someone might question their right to be there. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man questioning my competence was placing passenger safety in the hands of technicians who'd learned their trade from YouTube videos and simulation programs. Change of plans, Radison, he announced, not even looking at me directly. His eyes were fixed on his tablet, scrolling through schedules and cost projections while discussing human lives. Peterson and Walsh will handle 447's inspection today. You can work on the cargo plane maintenance instead. Cargo planes. The demotion was subtle but unmistakable, from passenger aircraft where my expertise was valued to freight haulers where, presumably, my declining abilities could do less damage. The message was clear: Riley Radison was being put out to pasture, one assignment at a time. Sir, I'm already prepped for 447. I've reviewed the previous maintenance logs, and there were some hydraulic pressure fluctuations noted in the last inspection that I wanted to investigate further. I kept my voice level, professional, even as frustration burned in my chest. The crew reports suggest an intermittent problem that might not show up in standard pressure tests. Lawson's head snapped up from his tablet, and for a moment I saw genuine irritation flash across his features. He didn't like being second-guessed, especially not by someone he'd already decided was past her expiration date. Are you questioning my decision? His voice carried that particular edge that middle management perfects over years of practice, authoritative enough to intimidate subordinates, petty enough to reveal the insecurity underneath. The junior technicians shifted nervously, suddenly fascinated by their clipboards, while the morning crew nearby pretended not to listen. I chose my words carefully, aware that every sentence could be the one that ended my career prematurely. Not questioning, just concerned about continuity. When there are existing issues to monitor, it helps to have someone familiar with the aircraft's history handle the inspection. The existing issues, if there are any, will be handled by technicians who are current on the latest protocols. The emphasis on current landed like a physical blow, designed to wound as much as to dismiss. Maybe it's time you considered whether you're still up to the demands of modern aviation maintenance. Modern aviation maintenance. As if the fundamental principles of keeping aircraft airworthy had somehow changed since I'd started my career. As if hydraulic systems now operated on different physics, or metal fatigue had been eliminated by corporate efficiency programs. That's when he delivered the killing blow: too old to keep up with aviation standards. Maybe you should finally retire before you kill someone. The words echoed across the hangar, loud enough for half the morning shift to hear. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as heads turned our way, then quickly looked away again when they realized they were witnessing a professional execution. The junior technicians stared at their feet, uncomfortable with being cast as my replacements in such a public humiliation. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, but kept my expression neutral. 27 years had taught me that dignity trumps pride, and sometimes the smartest move is to let someone hang themselves with their own rope. Lawson was counting on an emotional reaction, anger, defensiveness, anything that would justify his characterization of me as a problem employee resistant to change. Instead, I simply nodded. Understood, sir. I'll move to the cargo bay. But as I walked away, my toolbox heavy in my hand, my mind was already cataloging everything I knew about Flight 447's maintenance history. The hydraulic issue wasn't just some minor anomaly to be ignored, it was the kind of intermittent problem that could escalate from inconvenience to catastrophe under the right conditions. The kind of thing that experience teaches you to treat seriously, even when all the gauges read normal. Peterson and Walsh were good kids, don't get me wrong. Eager, well-trained according to current standards, armed with the latest diagnostic equipment and certification on all current procedures. What they lacked was the intuitive understanding that comes from seeing the same problems manifest in dozens of different ways over thousands of hours of hands-on work. I'd trained dozens of young technicians over the years, and the best ones understood that formal education was just the beginning. The real learning happened in the field, troubleshooting problems that didn't match textbook scenarios, developing the sixth sense that tells you when something is wrong even when you can't immediately explain why. But Lawson's new efficiency protocols didn't allow time for that kind of mentorship. Inspections were scheduled down to the minute, with performance metrics based on throughput rather than thoroughness. The goal was to process as many aircraft as possible with minimal labor costs, trusting that standardized procedures would catch any safety issues. It was a fundamentally flawed approach that ignored the unpredictable nature of mechanical systems. Airplanes aren't manufactured widgets rolling off an assembly line, they're complex machines operating in harsh environments, subject to stresses that no engineer can fully predict. Each one develops its own personality over time, its own quirks and warning signs that experienced technicians learn to recognize and respect. I spent the next 4 hours going through the motions on a cargo plane that didn't need inspection, a reliable old Airbus A300F that I could have cleared for service in my sleep. But my hands moved automatically through familiar routines while my mind kept drifting to Bay 7, where Peterson and Walsh were conducting what might be the most important inspection of their young careers without even realizing it. Through the hangar's glass partition, I could see them working methodically through their checklist, tablets in hand, following procedures with the mechanical precision of people who trusted protocols over instinct. They checked fluid levels, normal. Tested pump pressures, within specifications. Visually inspected accessible components, no obvious defects noted. Around 11 a.m., I watched Peterson crawl out from beneath the aircraft, wiping his hands on a shop rag while Walsh updated their digital inspection form. They'd found nothing wrong because they were looking for the obvious problems that procedures were designed to catch: leaks, worn components, readings outside normal parameters. What they couldn't see, couldn't test for with standard equipment, was the subtle degradation that 27 years of experience had taught me to recognize. Hydraulic systems are like the circulatory system of an aircraft, blood vessels carrying life-sustaining pressure to control surfaces that keep 300 people alive. When that system starts to fail, it rarely announces itself with dramatic symptoms. Instead, it whispers warnings through pressure fluctuations that come and go, through tiny variations in response time that only experienced hands can feel, through patterns of wear that take years to develop and expertise to interpret. The crew reports on Flight 447 weren't describing random anomalies, they were describing the early symptoms of what I suspected was internal seal degradation in the primary hydraulic pump. Not enough to cause complete failure under normal conditions, but potentially catastrophic if combined with the increased pressure demands of emergency maneuvers or bad weather approaches. But Peterson and Walsh didn't know the aircraft's history the way I did. They didn't know that this particular pump had been replaced 18 months ago with a rebuilt unit rather than a new one, or that rebuilt pumps sometimes developed subtle internal problems that wouldn't show up for months or years after installation. They didn't know that the flight crews reporting the pressure fluctuations were all experienced pilots whose observations deserved serious attention even when ground tests couldn't reproduce the problem. Most critically, they didn't know to be suspicious of readings that looked normal. Sometimes normal is the most dangerous reading of all when your experience tells you something should be abnormal. Around noon, I saw them finishing their walk-around inspection, clipboards filled with checkmarks and signatures, professional satisfaction evident in their posture. They'd followed every procedure correctly, tested every system thoroughly, and found no discrepancies worth noting. By any official measure, they'd done their job perfectly. But perfect adherence to procedures isn't the same thing as perfect understanding of aircraft systems. Procedures are designed to catch common problems, experience teaches you to look for uncommon ones. Procedures tell you what to test, expertise tells you what the test results actually mean. As I watched them sign off on Flight 447's inspection, I felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach, the same feeling I'd learned to trust over decades of maintenance work. Something was wrong with that aircraft, something subtle enough to hide from standard inspections but potentially deadly under the wrong circumstances. Did I consider saying something? Of course. The thought of walking over to Bay 7 and explaining my concerns crossed my mind a dozen times that afternoon. But Lawson had made it abundantly clear that my input wasn't welcome, and going over his head would be career suicide for whatever time I had left at Aerosystems. Besides, what could I say? That my gut told me there was a problem even though all the tests showed normal readings? That my experience suggested the crew reports indicated developing hydraulic pump failure even though the pump was testing within specifications? That sometimes you have to trust pilot observations over ground equipment, especially when multiple crews report similar anomalies? In the old days, when aviation valued experience over efficiency, those concerns would have been taken seriously. A senior technician's judgment carried weight, earned through years of seeing problems that textbooks couldn't anticipate. But under the new regime, gut feelings and intuitive assessments were dismissed as unscientific relics of aviation's primitive past. So I kept my mouth shut and watched Flight 447 taxi away from the gate right on schedule, carrying 300 passengers toward Phoenix while I wondered whether I was being overcautious or whether I was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. The afternoon passed slowly, filled with routine maintenance tasks that felt meaningless compared to the anxiety gnawing at my conscience. I found myself checking flight tracking websites, following N4447AS's progress across the country, noting with relief each successful waypoint passage. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe the hydraulic system would hold up fine, maybe the crew reports were just random anomalies, maybe Peterson and Walsh's inspection had been adequate after all. But experience had taught me that hope isn't a maintenance strategy, and wishful thinking doesn't prevent mechanical failures. Somewhere over Colorado, Flight 447 was carrying its precious cargo through the sky on hydraulic systems that I was increasingly convinced were operating on borrowed time. The call came 5 days later, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other but would end with careers in ruins and lives forever changed. I was in my office, a cramped space barely large enough for a desk, filing cabinet, and the accumulated documentation of nearly 3 decades in aviation maintenance. The walls were covered with aircraft diagrams, maintenance bulletins, and photos of planes I'd worked on over the years, a visual history of my professional life that Lawson's efficiency programs would soon reduce to digital files and cloud storage. I was updating maintenance logs when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of controlled panic echoing through the hallways. Not the ordinary urgency of a missed deadline or scheduling conflict, but the particular brand of chaos that erupts when something has gone catastrophically wrong. Voices rose in pitch and intensity, phones started ringing with increasing frequency, and the normal rhythm of office life disintegrated into confusion and alarm. Then came the running footsteps, not the quick walk of someone late for a meeting, but the desperate pace of someone carrying news too urgent for normal protocols. The footsteps stopped outside Lawson's corner office, followed by a moment of terrible silence before his door exploded open with enough force to rattle the windows throughout the administrative wing. Why was a plane forced into an emergency landing with 300 passengers aboard? The voice belonged to Regional Director Patricia Cole, and she was definitely not asking politely. Cole was a legend in aviation circles, a former Air Force pilot who transitioned to commercial aviation management without losing any of her military precision or tolerance for incompetence. When Patricia Cole asked a question in that particular tone of voice, careers hung in the balance waiting for the answer. Behind her stood what looked like a small army of people in expensive suits, FAA investigators with their trademark grim expressions, company executives whose presence meant the situation had escalated far beyond routine operational concerns, and lawyers whose very existence suggested someone was about to be held legally accountable for what had happened. From my office, I couldn't hear Lawson's response, but I didn't need to. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity, like tumblers clicking in a lock that I'd desperately hoped would never open. Flight 447. The hydraulic system I'd wanted to investigate further. The intermittent pressure fluctuations that Peterson and Walsh had been unable to reproduce. The growing certainty I'd carried for 5 days that something was terribly wrong with an aircraft I'd been prevented from properly inspecting. The official details emerged over the following hours through a combination of leaked information, official statements, and the kind of informal communication network that exists in any close-knit industry. Flight 447 had suffered complete hydraulic failure during final approach to Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. The crew had declared an emergency, executed a textbook dead-stick approach using backup systems, and managed to land the aircraft safely with no injuries among the 300 passengers and crew. But safe landing or not, the incident represented everything the aviation industry fears most, a critical system failure that could have resulted in mass casualties if not for exceptional piloting skill and pure luck. The fact that everyone walked away didn't change the fundamental question: how had a routine maintenance inspection missed a problem serious enough to cause total hydraulic failure just days later? The investigation that followed was methodical, thorough, and devastating in its conclusions. Teams of experts descended on Aerosystems International like investigators at a crime scene, examining every document, interviewing every person involved, reconstructing the chain of decisions that had led to Flight 447's near disaster. The failed component turned out to be exactly what I'd suspected, the primary hydraulic pump that had been installed as a rebuilt unit 18 months earlier. Internal seal degradation had progressed to the point where the pump could no longer maintain adequate pressure under high-demand conditions, leading to cascading failures throughout the hydraulic system during the approach phase when control surface demands were at their peak. The seal degradation was subtle, progressive, and exactly the kind of problem that experienced technicians learn to detect through careful attention to pilot reports and system behavior over time. The intermittent pressure fluctuations reported by multiple flight crews weren't random anomalies, they were early warning signs of impending failure, as predictable as sunrise to someone who knew how to read the symptoms. The investigation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of interviews, records reviews, and the slow, methodical process of determining exactly how a routine maintenance inspection had missed a critical system failure. 3 weeks of watching Lawson's swagger dissolve into desperate finger-pointing and excuse-making. The hydraulic line had failed completely during final approach, the same system I'd flagged for continued monitoring. The same system that Peterson and Walsh had signed off as within acceptable parameters. The same system that 27 years of experience had taught me to treat with suspicion when pressure readings fluctuated even slightly. The investigators found multiple contributing factors, of course. There always are. But the root cause was simple: inexperience substituted for expertise in the name of cost-cutting and ego management. 2 junior technicians, following checklist procedures to the letter, had missed the kind of nuanced assessment that only comes with decades of practice. Was I vindicated? Technically, yes. The FAA report noted that the hydraulic issue should have been flagged for replacement rather than continued monitoring. My previous inspection notes were entered into evidence as proof that the problem had been identified and should have been addressed. But vindication is a cold comfort when you're cleaning out your office at 58, officially taking early retirement while your former employer scrambles to avoid criminal negligence charges. Aerosystems survived, barely. Lawson didn't, terminated for cause, his career in aviation effectively over. Do I feel sorry for him? That's a question I ask myself more often than I'd like to admit. He was a petty tyrant who let personal bias cloud professional judgment, and his actions could have killed 300 people. But he was also a product of a system that prioritizes appearances over substance, cost reduction over safety margins. The real tragedy isn't that he fell, it's that it took a near disaster to expose what should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. Experience isn't just about following procedures, it's about knowing when procedures aren't enough, when the subtle signs point to problems that haven't quite manifested yet. As for Greg Lawson? Last I heard, he was selling insurance in Phoenix. Probably telling his clients about his extensive background in risk management. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so depressing. But that's his story to tell, not mine. Mine is about the moment when being too old to keep up with aviation standards revealed itself to be exactly what aviation standards needed most. Sometimes being dismissed is the first step toward being proven right. The trick is surviving long enough to see the proof.